You're listening to The Switch. The Switch is a podcast where we explore ideas and experiences that change our minds. In this episode, we talk to one of my friends, Jon Lindinger, about Stoicism.
So Stoicism is probably a word that a lot of people have heard, and more commonly in our culture, Stoic. And you might think of somebody who's Stoic as unemotional and calm in response to basically anything, I guess. But what we're talking about here is the philosophy of Stoicism. And Chase, if you could give us a definition of that.
Sure. Yeah, so Stoicism at its core is a practical philosophy of personal ethics, how to act in the world. It's centered around living in accordance with nature and not being caught up in emotional responses to things.
Stoicism is one of those philosophies that's been around a long time. It started out in Greece, and one of the Roman emperors, Marcus Aurelius, became a Stoic and eventually became one of the primary Stoic philosophers, with his book Meditations being read all around the world. I know one of my friends read it in college. That was the one Stoic text that I had read leading up to this conversation. And through talking to Jon, I definitely learned more about the mindset and the philosophy, because it's something that he really employs in his own life, whereas Buddhism or meditation would be something that I do. So there are definitely some similarities between those. For example, the awareness of your emotions. I think both Buddhism and Stoicism place an importance on that, and maybe to different ends, but I think it's helpful to be aware that you're basing a lot of your decisions based on how you're feeling, and whether, not even deciding if that's a bad thing, just being aware of it makes a big difference.
So you and I are in different places, and we typically record remotely. You're in Florida, I'm in New York. For this interview, I was lucky enough to be able to talk to Jon face to face, which was great, but because of that, it presented some technical issues with getting you into the conversation. And long story short, my laptop battery died, and you were only able to be there for the first half of the conversation. Luckily, Jon had a good time. Hopefully we'll have him on again, and you can ask questions that you may not have gotten to ask, and we'll get a little more of his story next time.
Yeah, and at the end of the podcast or now, if you like what we do here on The Switch, you can check us out on social media. On Instagram and Twitter, we are at Switch_podcast. And on Facebook, we are The Switch Podcast.
So, without further delay, we start with a quote from a famous Stoic, Seneca, talking about how to act virtuously in the face of danger and difficulty. If a man can look at flashing swords with eyes unswerving, if he knows that it is of no moment to him whether his soul departs through mouth or throat, call him happy. Call him happy if, when physical torture is decreed for him, whether by some accident or by force majeure, if with mind unperturbed he hears of chains and exile and the empty terrors of mankind and says, "No new fashion of hardship, none unexpected rises to confront me. All I have anticipated, all have I traversed in my mind. Today it is you that confront me with this doom. I have always confronted myself with it, and as a man am prepared for man's lot." The blow of an anticipated evil falls soft. Fools, however, and those who trust fortune, find every fashion new and unexpected. For the untaught, a large portion of the evil is its novelty. The proof is that men bear with fortitude, when they have grown accustomed to them, things they had thought very difficult. The sage accustoms himself to evils before they come, and what others make easy by long toleration, he makes easy by long cogitation. Sometimes we hear the untaught say, "I knew this was in store for me." The sage knows that everything is in store for him, and whatever happens, he says, "I knew it." And with that, welcome to The Switch, Jon Lindinger.
Yes.
Today, we have an interesting topic that I'm very fond of. We're going to be talking about Stoicism. And we have Jon on in particular because he and I both attend this meetup group. It's an intellectual type of thing, and that's how I met you.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that you and I had in common right off from the bat, or right from the right off was we both studied Stoicism, and we're both into the Stoic philosophers and have deeply thought about some of these things.
Sure.
So before we get into Stoicism and what exactly it is, it's primarily philosophy. So can you give me just an introduction about you, maybe where you come from, your relationship with philosophy, and pretty much everything leading up to finding out about Stoicism?
Sure. Stoicism was the most recent, I guess, body of beliefs and information that I have subscribed into my life and implemented. Right before that was philosophy, but the background, I guess, starting the intellectual pursuit was initially from getting involved in a sales position, right? So in an entrepreneurial position, it's highly centered on your results are proportionate to your effort. So this calls for a lot of self-development. This calls for a lot of pursuit of information that's out of your comfort zone, and results are not guaranteed as typically most business operations are commission based, right? So I started building a library based off self-help books. Started branching off slightly. After a few years, I noticed a lot of it was kind of filler. I wanted to get into the core beliefs behind a lot of those self-help books, and where they came from, right? What preceded those. So I started to get into psychology, and then, I was always obviously everybody's vaguely familiar with names like Socrates and Plato, and I wanted to know why they are still prevalent today. What makes their ideas survive thousands and thousands of years when there's a myriad of thinkers and speakers today that, maybe their books will stay on the shelves and they'll be forgot about, right? So I was very fascinated by that, the fact that they've survived thousands of years. And I started to get into their works and, Aristotle in particular. But the thing with philosophy, and I was actually just reading this online somewhere, that a philosophy that cannot be implemented is simply a hobby, right? So I was really interested in Stoicism before I even knew what Stoicism was. What I mean by that is I was just going out as I developed this interest in philosophy. I would pick up a bunch of books at a time, half a dozen or so. I think the first was probably Meditations by Marcus Aurelius.
The first Stoic.
The first Stoic,
okay.
Correct.
Yeah.
And then it was, Letters from a Stoic, Seneca, and then it was Art of Living, Epictetus.
Yep.
And before I categorized them into the box of quote unquote Stoicism, those texts highly resonated with me because they not only told you what to think, they told you what to do, right? It boiled down, in my interpretation, what I've got from Aristotle and Plato and all that. It's very ethereal, right? It's very amorphous. It's hard to implement in your life. It's cool to sit there and think about, but as I've been pretty action oriented in my life, I'm inclined to believe, in being so fond of the self-help and the business things, I was always focused on, implementation. And I think part of that was the conditioning from the business, the self-help books. It's here are some topics. And they'll literally have it in the book verbatim, like, here's your 3-step process, right? And Stoicism is highly favored by me for that reason.
Okay, so I think that's actually a good place to run into the question of what is Stoicism, and we'll get back to sort of its main impact on you. But I want to make sure that anybody listening to this has a baseline understanding of what is it we're talking about when we talk about Stoicism. So if you could give, a quick definition, or however long it takes to give a definition.
Sure. Well, this is my subjective interpretation of it. Would be. It's a philosophy that places high emphasis on accountability. It's a set of beliefs that you adopt that will help you be more prepared to handle the inevitable trauma and negativity that is prevalent in the world. And I don't think there's another set of beliefs or set of information or collection of data that is as efficient as preparing you for the, I guess, downfalls that are inevitable in life as Stoicism is.
So how would a Stoic handle some like, you could give just like a generic case of suffering or of I guess the Buddhist terminology would be suffering, but the inevitable things that you're talking about, what's the sort of standard Stoic response to that kind of situation?
Awareness and self-awareness, number one. Two, being cognizant of the fact that nothing outside of you has power over your mind.
Wow.
So you choose your reaction. And at any moment, we can change our reaction.
The way that I've heard that described is, the Stoics sort of thought of life as two categories. There's the things that are under your control and the things that are not. And you have sort of this obligation to understand what's happening in terms of those two categories. And when things in life hit you that are not under your control, you deal with that by sort of recognizing the fact that, hey, this is not under my control. Let me focus on what is and how I can deal with things.
Right.
Is that a fair characterization, or do you have a different sort of idea?
No, that's congruent with everything.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you discovered this, how did it impact you? Like, what changed about your mindset in life? Or was it more just like a solidification of something that you had already figured out?
It was both, former and latter. Primarily was the fact of accountability. We are kind of conditioned to have a victim mindset and kind of continually place blame on it. I think in particular, the most influential catalyst it's been in my life was I am very rarely, if ever, in a bad mood. Because, and I read this from actually a self-help book from Brian Tracy, negative emotions can only exist when you place blame on something outside of yourself. Right. So if you take accountability, it's hard to have those two things coexist. Right. You can't necessarily take full accountability and also be in a negative state.
Do you think you can still be sad and not place blame on other, like, outside events?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So
Go ahead, Alex.
basically, you were just talking about how by adopting these philosophies, these principles of Stoicism, it's basically evens out your mood, helps you to navigate the world in a more agreeable way, I guess, or more accepting way. But I think there are some states, right, that we don't choose. Like, we don't choose to be sad, like when something bad happens, right? And in the Buddhist way of thinking about it is that initial sadness is something that we can't avoid, but our reaction to it is basically, like, we don't have to keep dwelling on it forever. So would you say that kind of lines up with what we were saying? Like, do you think that first part, that first initial emotion, is something that Stoicism helps you avoid? Like, does it just curb that initial response?
I don't necessarily think it's avoiding that. I think it's just superseding it, because if you look at psychology and I guess neurobiology, I guess we have, we'll have a very instantaneous reaction to an external event, right? Like you said, it's kind of inevitable that we're going to be sad. That can be an interpretation of the limbic brain in response to stimuli, right? The mammalian brain, the reptilian brain, and an immediate response. And then you wait a few seconds and your logical faculties kick in, right? Your higher functioning capabilities from your neocortex, and you can kind of analyze that situation accordingly. And that's kind of how I look at it at that higher level. It's superimposed over that emotional response limbic brain, but we don't necessarily have to immediately run with that emotional response.
Okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense for sure.
Yeah. So, okay. Yeah. Yeah. That's very similar to the Buddhist conception of suffering, and the classic example is always somebody cuts you off in traffic. And at first you have this immediate response of like, well, that jerk just, had disregard for my life or whatever. And it's like you said, the mammalian brain kicking in and getting you defensively worked up. But in Buddhism, the idea is, well, the only way for somebody whose higher faculties have kicked in to maintain that state is to constantly remind yourself
Right.
how much of a jerk that person was, and just keep replaying the movie of that scene in your head. And that's what keeps you mad. But if you're mindful of it, that you can sort of short circuit that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the difference between feeling sadness and being in a sad mood.
Right.
Yeah. Interesting. So one of the things that strikes me in Stoicism in particular is the Stoic conception of fate or God or nature. They sort of use these terms semi-interchangeably. And the Stoics definitely had a sort of theological bend to that. But I'm curious how you see that or how that's affected you, that idea of thinking of the laws of nature or fate or providence or anything like that. Like, do you spend any time thinking about that aspect of what happens in the world?
Sure. A large part of my philosophy is very congruent with the natural world. And as we know, a Stoicism mantra is to live consistently with nature, right? And I'll almost take that in a literal translation in terms of the implication of the Fibonacci sequence, for example, of all organic life continually evolving to emulate a specific numerical ratio of that of the phi ratio, 1.618, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So to live consistently with nature, right, would be to live consistently with a fundamental expression of growth, right? Surmounting failure, and your growth is going to be proportionate to the amount of failure and uncertainty and setbacks you can overcome and surmount, right?
Yeah.
So I take it in a more literal interpretation to live consistently with nature.
Interesting. Yeah, my take on those kinds of things was definitely more of like so Seneca has this essay called On Providence, where his friend Lucilius asked him a question: why do good things happen to bad people, and why do bad things happen to good people? And Seneca sort of turns the question sideways and says, well, that's not actually how things work. Mm-hmm. What's happening is that things are happening to people. Yeah. And in the Stoic conception of all this, it's some sort of like divine intelligence, like that's got a plan for things, or that's set things in motion to act a certain way. And so he's saying, well, the gods would never put us in a situation that we weren't supposed to be in. Right. And for me, that's like, since I discovered him talking about that and the way that he goes through it, it's become like a powerful metaphor for sort of thinking, well, this idea of nothing human is alien to me. Anything that can happen to somebody could happen to me. And therefore the bigger question is not, if I'm a good person, why do bad things happen to me? Or if I'm a bad person, why do good things happen? The bigger question is like, how am I going to use this opportunity of whatever is happening, whatever providence has provided, metaphor or not, to be good or bad? Right. So that's sort of where I was going with the providence.
I love that you included that. Whatever, anything human is not foreign to me.
Yeah.
I don't know verbatim, but Aurelius says this somewhere in Meditations. He says, "He who is surprised at anything that happens in life is a stranger to life." Hmm. I don't know if it's verbatim, but it's somewhere in there.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
I mean, I pretty much agree with that. I'm not super familiar with Stoicism. I read a bit of Meditations like a few years back, and I started reading it again in prep for this. But it seems to me like Stoicism, and John, correct me if you think I'm off the mark here, but it's kind of just like a philosophy of being undeceived by emotions, kind of like a release from that like cycle of desires and aversions. And with that freedom, you're able to craft the life that you believe is the best you can have. And the best would be derived basically from like looking at the world logically, I guess.
Right. Yeah, it's exactly right. I'm in agreement with that. I like that you use the word cycle. It's true. Yeah. It's escaping that cycle.
And I have more experience with Buddhism. And when Chase and I have talked about Stoicism in the past, it seems like there's a lot of similarities. And I wanted to actually get into that eventually, but it basically seemed to me, I think one of the core tenets of Stoicism is that it's practical, right?
Exactly.
So like what you said at the beginning, philosophy that can't be implemented is purely a hobby.
Right.
So do you think Stoicism has a point at which you should stop, like I don't want to make this sound like it's like a logical dead end, because it's not, but like a point where you should just stop there and kind of go with that? Like, for example, I think this is the best way. I could keep looking in and looking deeper and deeper, searching forever and never do anything. Or should I just kind of set it here? I think this is best. Let me act as if this were true.
Yeah, Seneca actually has that in letters. He says, when you're studying, you shouldn't be memorizing, these words. You should be delivering yourself with them, right?
Mm-hmm.
He says that explicitly in letters from a Stoic. So I think it's a matter of, use what you have, start where you are, and do what you can.
Okay.
Today.
Yeah. And he also even says that, I can't remember the exact words, but it is definitely from Seneca. And the beginning of the line, I wish I could remember, but the latter half is, anything that is true belongs to Stoicism. Like it's a philosophy where, you've got these sort of core tenets of how is best to act in the world, but it's also open to new information. It's a school of philosophy, dead now, but at the time, their premise was, okay, if we discover something to be different than we think it is, we have to accept that, because that's nature. That's the way that it is. I did want to touch on this idea of impermanence, because John, you and I had a discussion with one of the other members of our meetup group, and she and I had talked about it extensively before I started to include you in it. But I asked you a question about, well, let me backpedal a little bit. The idea of impermanence, that nothing in life is static the way that it is. Things are always changing. One of the things that includes is tragedy, like death. And the sort of antidote to tragedy and impermanence, the suffering caused by impermanence, is to avoid getting too attached to things. And by attachment, I just mean like the kind of attachment that is in denial of the fact that things are impermanent. Like the example we were talking about is, if you're in love with someone, but you don't acknowledge that they could die today, they could die tomorrow, you could die today, it could be over. Is it possible to, and this is an open question to you as well, Alex, is it possible to have an intimate connection with someone without becoming unduly attached like that, without denying the impermanent nature of things?
Sure.
It could be your philosophy. It could be what you think the Stoics thought. It's an open question.
I think a lot of the suffering will come after the disattachment with something that you hold dear to yourself. With, going from the philosophy of a guy named Eckhart Tolle. He wrote The Power of Now. The sequel to that, the book called A New Earth, he talks about the ego and the structure of the ego and why we suffer, and how it operates is the ego tends to equate having with being, right? It associates thought forms and roles with your identity. What I mean by that is, when I ask somebody who they are, the first thing that pops to mind is the egoic structures, right? I am a father, I'm a husband, I'm a banker, I'm all these different roles they're going to play, right? It's what people do, right? Or what they see. So where I'm going with that is, if I see my identity as a boyfriend or a husband to that beloved other, and that falls apart, the ego is going to see it as a threat to its very identity, to its very survival. It tends to equate having with being. So that's the whole phenomenon of cognitive dissonance, right? We know the new information is truthful, it could be potentially helpful, but the ego sees it as a threat to its very identity. And if you're completely immersed in ego, completely immersed in these thought forms, I think that's where we experience a lot of suffering. So conversely, if you're living in the now, if you're living as, and Tolle calls it in formlessness, he calls it, you can be in the present and, all the beneficial thoughts and states and phenomenon of love and everything that comes with that without seeing yourself as you are in relation to that other person.
Alex, do you want to give any pushback on that?
No, I don't think so.
Me either. I think that was very well put.
If you don't mind, I'd kind of like to go back and just make sure we have a foundation there for people who are totally unfamiliar. So,
Sure.
Do you think so? A couple questions here. Do you think everybody can benefit from this? Do you think everybody practically can? And wime would they, basically?
Or should they?
Stoicism?
Yeah.
Oh, definitely. The biggest theme that was very attractive to me was taking accountability and responsibility for your life and your results in your life. And I think that's a very needed thing today.
Mm-hmm.
It's imperative.
I think one of the things that we see in Buddhist practice is there are people who should not go on silent retreat. There are people for whom meditation is destabilizing. And so there are certain people whose psychological states mean that they probably should not practice Buddhism. Maybe philosophically they'd be okay with it, but in practice it would be destabilizing. Do you think there is any part of Stoicism that could be potentially detrimental to someone if they were to try to implement?
Honestly, not particularly.
Yeah.
But then again, I could be biased. So
okay, that's fair.
I've read it for a long time. I identify with it, a lot of it. So I mean, I haven't really. And if I have met with any opposition, I see that was like a weaker me that didn't want to necessarily take responsibility for my life. And then after overcoming that, I kind of agree with all these principles. So, no, I can't think of anything particularly right now.
Yeah. And then the last question in this sort of section is, have you found connections with other thinkers that have come across similar ideas independently? So, for example, this guy, Jocko Willink, is a retired Navy SEAL. I don't know if he'd consider himself a philosopher, but he's got a philosophy. And many of the parts of his philosophy are very, very similar to Stoicism. He's got this principle called good, where a problem comes up, something happens in life, and your first gut reaction should be good.
Right.
And what stems from there is sort of a positive inclination to take action that's the right action, rather than to get caught up in whether what's happening is good or bad. So have you found any connections like that?
I mean, Jordan Peterson is one example. We actually just did a meetup Chase was referencing to in the beginning of this discussion here. We've done a meetup, actually, Chase and myself, on the similarities between Jordan Peterson and some Stoic principles. And I actually want to email this to you if you can kind of put this in the attached notes.
Absolutely.
I think it'd be very helpful.
Yeah, in the show notes, we'll have links to whatever attachments or anything that will be supplemental material. So.
Yeah. And for some context, I'm relating his book, 12 Rules of Life, to a lot of highlights and condensed information I've found from Letters from a Stoic from Seneca, Art of Living by Epictetus, and Meditations by Aurelius. I've kind of boxed them in distinct categories and found a lot of congruencies.
So we're running low on battery here. Do you want to go through a quick one of those before we have to let Alex go?
Yeah, I think the one that there's a lot here. There's I think 12 or 13, but the one that had the most profound impact and that was the most potent catalyst in my life was introspection, right? From Seneca. What really ruins our characters is the fact that none of us looks back over his life.
Yeah. Do you want to relate that to Peterson or? Yeah.
Sure. The connecting link would be there is, Peterson says the world is revealed to an indeterminate degree through the template of your values. If the world you are seeing is not the world you want, it's time to examine your values, right? So it's this innate philosophy of life doesn't have the problem, right? You have the problem. So it's nothing external. And Aurelius would be a huge proponent of that as well. It's nothing external has control over your own judgment, right? So everything outside is objective, and we either suffer or we flourish based on our interpretation and our analysis of that objective.
Do you think that at a like society level, if everybody was practicing Stoicism, it would work basically? Like if I guess like can everybody be rich? You know what I mean? Like I don't
Can
think
everybody do it?
Yeah,
right.
That's a very interesting line of thought. I think it places a high value on autonomy, right? Self-sufficiency. And I think, as Chase was saying, a lot of people might not necessarily inherently benefit off meditation, for example. It's a very useful practice for some, particularly, let's say, introverts or whatever categorization you want to impose there. And I think some people would have a hard time with it, maybe. Mm-hmm. I was naturally gravitating toward it because of I've always seen myself as highly autonomous, right? Highly self-sufficient. So it's something that really applied to me. I'm not sure how to answer that. That's a really good question, though.
Okay.
I think more should try. More should definitely try.
Yeah. And I tend to, my line of thought along this is I've found benefit from very similar philosophies in Buddhism and with some of my experience in Stoicism, which is limited. And like I mentioned before, to me, both of those kind of let me be released from that cycle, kind of like where tomorrow will be better. Oh, I'll be able to do that tomorrow. I'll feel better once I have this, or once this is over. And when you have the awareness to realize that none of those are true, that's all false, there really is only the current moment, it frees you from that train of thought and lets you take action now, basically, even if it's just noticing that.
Exactly.
So I think, to me, the most important thing would be the way Stoicism can help you be released from that cycle.
Yeah, that's a really important insight. I am very low on battery, so Alex, okay. I'm going to have to let you go in a second here. But if you want to put in any final thoughts, go for it.
No, just I think from my experience of talking to people, I think Stoicism might have a negative kind of reaction, just because it seems kind of like counter to nature, even though we've kind of proposed it as living with nature, to kind of deny those inherent emotions, which I think we hinted that we're not totally doing with Stoicism. Yeah. You acknowledge it and move forward. But I think there may be a barrier there to people wanting to accept it or seeing the benefit of it, I guess. And I'm not sure if that's even something that needs a response or anything, but.
Yeah, and actually, I think we'll get into some of the criticisms in a bit here, but unfortunately, my battery is low. So, Alex, thank you very much for joining this part of the discussion. Jon and I will continue after, and I will check in with you in the future.
Cool. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Alex.
All right. So, Alex has metaphorically left the building, and now it is just me and Jon. So let's maybe go over one or two more of these principles, that like actual quotes from Stoic thinkers, to see if we can get a little deeper understanding of what exactly it is we're talking about here.
Right.
So is there another quote that you want to bring up?
Yeah. Going off the same line of thought that I was a fan of before, it was introspection. This is from Epictetus in The Art of Living. On page 17, he says, "Every difficulty in life presents us with an opportunity to turn inward and to invoke our own submerged inner resources. Dig deeply. You possess strengths you might not realize you have. Find the right one. Use it." Right? So there's a lot of parts there. Find the right one. Finding implies what? Searching. Searching implies intention, right? Intention implies awareness. So a lot of these things have to do with, again, going back to the notions of autonomy and self-sufficiency, right? And I think this was really a particularly simple practice in my life. I've spent a lot of time in solitude, initially involuntarily, right? I was involuntarily, isolated, I guess, growing up. But I learned to constructively direct that into solitude. There's profound thinkers that have said a lot of things toward that. I think it's French philosopher Blaise Pascal. He says, all man's miseries derive from not being able to sit in a quiet room alone. Picasso said, without great solitude, no serious work is possible, right? So there's a lot of things there.
I think one of the things that I wanted to, or that came to mind while you were saying that, is that a lot of people have this automatic intrinsic association between introspection, meditation, and solitude. But especially with that exact quote that you just read, introspection is not necessarily something you have to do in solitude. It can be something that you do out in the world. In fact, if you could actually just read the quote again, and I will stop you right at the point where I wanted to hit a very specific idea.
Every difficulty in life presents us with an opportunity to turn inward and to invoke our own submerged inner resources. Dig deeply. Dig deeply. Yeah. So that's actually something. So there are these endurance events called Go Ruck. That'll be the next episode of the podcast. Right.
One of the things that you hear in these events when you're doing something that's very, very difficult is dig deep. They say to you, dig deep. And you're in this team environment. You're not alone.
Right.
And you're not supposed to feel alone. You see people going internal, and as a team, it's your responsibility to bring them out of that and to bring them back into the headspace of the team.
Right.
But that, when they say dig deep, that's what they're talking about. They're saying find those internal resources, use this difficult moment to introspect and bring out something you may not have known you had.
Right.
And I find these connections everywhere with Stoicism and like in everyday practice. Yeah. And for me, that's how that quote struck me, is that like this introspective process is something that you can do anywhere. You don't have to be in solitude. But the solitude point is definitely a solid one.
Yeah, it could be just more intensely, it could be elicited more intensely, right, through solitude, right? And it's like if you're in a group environment like that, if you've been to that place deep inside yourself, it'll be more familiar, right? And if you haven't, and they say dig deeply, you can be, what are you talking about? Where, and if there's, whenever there's confusion about something, we just think of something else immediately, right? If somebody says a foreign concept where we can't relate to it, we're just going to think of something else, right? So it'll pay to have been there before. So you can actively bring up those resources.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to bring up another quote here from Seneca. So the reason I keep bringing up Seneca is because that's the first Stoic that I encountered, and to me, he's one of the more easily accessible ones because I don't know, just his style appeals to me. The other names we mentioned, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, those are people I ended up reading later, but Seneca really sticks with me. So I just want to get your thoughts on this particular idea. So this is an essay called The Consolation of Helvia, who is his mother, and he basically wrote her this letter when he was sentenced to exile, and he knew that his mother was grieving for the fact that he was gone. And he's telling her, all about why things are going to be okay, and she shouldn't grieve. And so this is a paragraph somewhere in the middle. He says, "Briskly, therefore, and with head held high, let us stride with dauntless step wherever circumstances carry us. Let us traverse any lands whatever. Within the world there can be no exile, for nothing within the world is alien to man. From any spot wherever eyes can be raised to heaven equally well. The interval between the divine and the human is everywhere constant, so long as my eyes are not barred that spectacle which they are never sated. Therefore, so long as I may contemplate sun and moon, so long as I may dwell upon other planets, so long as I may study their risings and settings and speculate upon the realms of their rapid or slower pace, behold the numberless stars gleaming in the night, some fixed, some not sweeping in a wide orbit, but circling their own track, some suddenly bursting forth, some dazzling our vision with an effusion of fire as if they were falling or flying by with a long train of brilliant light. So long as I can commune with these and mingle with heavenly bodies as far as a mortal may, so long as I may keep my mind always directed to the contemplation of kindred stuff on high, what matter to me what ground I tread? Yeah, that's it. He's basically saying, like, what does it matter to me if I'm in exile or not, if I still have, like, you can't exile my mind. You can't put my mind in jail.
Right.
I can still contemplate things. I can still figure out how to do the best with what I've got.
Right.
What does it matter to me where I am?
Yeah. Yeah, that's huge. And that's a very drastic implication, or imposition rather, of an external circumstance of hardship, right? And I think that's where our philosophies are tested the most, right? And, our adherence to these philosophies are proportionate to the external stimuli that tries to derail us from those philosophies. And he was obviously very rooted in that. And I love what you said at the end there. Epictetus says that, he was a former slave, for people that don't know. And he says, on speaking when he's going to go to prison, he says, "You will throw me into the prison." No, correction, it is my body you will throw there. So keeping that equanimity of mental control is very, very useful, very practical.
Yeah.
Very helpful.
Speaking of practical, let's talk about a couple of practical implementations of Stoicism. It's all well and good to talk philosophy and talk mindset, and the nice thing about Stoicism is that it is very practical. But are there any like day-to-day specific things that you maybe could recommend to someone trying to cultivate this mindset, or things that you do as a result of taking on this mindset?
Yeah. Quantification or identification of beliefs, right? So we live in the world. We live to interpret the world through our lens. Our lens was built on information from proximity that we picked up by accident, maybe partially through design, right? Through intentional study. I think that's the latter is the more rare case. And why I say that is because we are consistently looking to place blame on something outside of ourselves. And I think that's such a huge reason for negative emotions in the world today, right? As I mentioned earlier, it's hard to kind of hold those two beliefs of accountability and a negative emotion. Because when you accept accountability, you immediately look for a solution, because that's an undesirable state. It's an undesirable condition to be in. So when we're faced with that difficulty, any difficulty really, we have two options. We have to externally place the blame, or we have accountability. And I think accountability is what Alex is referring to, is breaking that cycle of blame and of continual, cognitive bias of looking for everything going wrong and everything negative. And something that's beautifully appropriate is from Epictetus. He says, "Undisciplined people are forever on the lookout for signs that build up or reinforce their unexamined views and opinions." Those last four words are very powerful. Unexamined views and opinions. We know that Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living. So I think that's very profound, that we quantify and analyze our beliefs. I don't just mean conceptually, I mean physically write them on paper. In terms of a practical way to do this, maybe not particularly every day, but could be weekly or monthly, or at least once, is to write down a topic. Let's say career, or let's say friends, or let's say the outside world, or let's say society, and just immediately begin to list all the associative beliefs that come to mind. Further, you want to analyze their source. Where did those come from? Did they come from school? Did they come from your parents? Did they come from a credible source? Are they reliable? Are they truthful? And then kind of act accordingly.
Yeah, and maybe even like sort of cross-analyze what you believe to be ideal and what you believe to be real about your life. Yeah. So with friends, for example, if your value is, well, I want friends who want the best for me, then that's really only worth anything as a value if you then sort of implement that and go, okay, are my friends people who want the best for me? And how do I go
Right.
about doing that? Yeah. That's exactly right. The other thing that I would mention as a sort of in practice Stoic ritual, this is pretty common. It's called premeditatio malorum, which is basically the idea of the way that some people do it is first thing in the morning when you get up, part of your morning meditation is basically to say, here are all the ways today could go wrong. Here are all the ways that I could die today. Here are all the ways that my friends could die today. Here are all the bad things that could happen to me at work. Here are all the ways I could lose my job today. Here are all the things that could go wrong today that I can possibly think of. And it may not be practical to find all of them, but to spend 10 minutes just in this state of thinking about everything that could go wrong, and the outcome of that being that as you move throughout your day, every time you cross a sidewalk, every time you successfully park your car, right, when you leave your job at the end of the day and you haven't been fired, there's a moment of almost gratitude of being like, well, the bad things didn't happen. And even if they had, I would have been prepared for them. And that's the big part of this is not just doom and gloom thinking, but going, okay, if, my friends die today, life will still go on. I will be okay. And it'll hurt, but I'll be prepared for it. I'm going to prepare the best that I can, understanding that here are all the things that would be difficult for me to handle and mitigating that difficulty by thinking about them beforehand. And I think that was Seneca's point with the opening quote as well. I have it right here. The sage accustoms himself to evils before they come, and what others make easy by long toleration, meaning after the fact, like, you lose a bunch of money, you tolerate that for a long time, and that's how it gets easier. The sage makes easy by long cogitation. He spends the effort and the energy to think about it beforehand so that when it happens, he understands how to deal with it. And I think that's the idea behind that practice. And that's my I don't know, prescription for everyday Stoicism. But so I actually want to transition into something a little different. And we have a segment on this podcast called The Off Topic, where the guests can come in and you can talk about basically anything that you'd like, and we'll spend some time on it. Why it's important to you. It could be an idea, it could be a practice, it could be a charity, it could be something somebody said to you the other day at the grocery store, whatever it is. And we'll spend some time just thinking about it and trying to understand. So, John, what do you got for us?
So I want to bring up the idea of the line of thinking in the topic of cybernetics.
Cybernetics. Okay, so elevator pitch. What is cybernetics?
The science of control and communication in the animal and in the machine.
What does that mean?
So it's a fancy way of saying what dictates our actions that we take.
Okay.
Right? So cybernetics, it's actually from a Greek word. It means the steersman, right? It was brought up about by a mathematician and a physicist, Norbert and Rosenbluth, right? Norbert Weiner and I forget the guy's first name, Rosenbluth. But it was initially for very, very complicated systemization for like computers and things like that, and it was adopted by this guy named Maxwell Maltz. Maxwell Maltz was not a physicist or scientist or anything. He was actually, or not even a psychologist for that matter, but he wrote a book called Psycho-Cybernetics, right? Psycho, the prefix dealing with the mind. So mind is cybernetics. So mind, cybernetics means control and communication. Mind, control and communication, right? And he wasn't even a psychologist. He was a plastic surgeon, right? But what he noticed in a lot of his patients was when you, and this is verbatim from his book, it's written in the 1960s, when you change a man's face, you change his whole future, right? So we kind of think of something as trivial as the proportions of your nose to an objective reality, right? How can that possibly change somebody's entire career and relationships and outcome in their entire life, right? What actually changes, he's observed, is the person's self-image. And that self-image in a whole nutshell, is the cybernetic mechanism, right? We are always going to operate and act in accordance with our self-image. Always. Always, always, always. And this has been such a huge school of thought, such a huge, such an influential line of thinking from me, from...
Well, can I just clarify the nose example, the nose proportion example?
Sure.
Are you talking about the independent variable, the change there being something like plastic surgery or something like a mindset of like, well, no, your nose isn't as big as you think it is, or both?
I'm saying something as trivial as your nose being 2 millimeters too big for you, whatever you see. You know what I mean?
Right.
And it's not the changing of that changes the person's life and future, that they're really happy after plastic surgery.
Right.
It's the person's self-image. They see themselves as more beautiful. They see themselves as more proportionate. They see themselves as more whole and more approachable, whatever their self-image happens to be in association or in accordance with that physical manifestation of their plastic surgery.
Okay.
Right. So the self-image, and this is also a line of thinking that has been picked up by, personal development giants like Earl Nightingale and Bob Proctor. And it has to do with paradigms and self-image and things like that. And Nightingale goes as far as to say, you will never outperform your self-image. That is extremely profound, right?
Yeah.
And there have been seminars from Bob Proctor and some other people that will go as far as to say is you don't have a financial problem in your life. You don't have a weight problem. You don't have a health problem. You don't have a productivity problem. What you actually have is a self-image problem, right? So all of those aspects, all of those results in your lives are simply expression of that self-image, right? So if you change the cause, you're going to change all of your effects, right? And it sounds, far-fetched, but with the line of thinking that, as Nightingale says, you're never going to outperform it, right? So it makes sense in a practical way of implementation, right? If I don't see myself as a, influential or as persuasive or as a leader or as, charismatic, for example, I'm not going to excel in sales, for example, right? And the interesting thing is that, as proposed by Maxwell Maltz in his book, is you can change his self-image. And if you're wondering what kind of self-image you have, it's not very hard to tell. You simply look at your results in your life.
Yeah.
All the results in your life. And they're just simply an outer expression of that inner image, in the words of Bob Proctor.
So within that framework, is there like an established mechanism for changing certain parts of your self-image?
Sure. In Psycho-Cybernetics, it's noted at least 4 times, I have it highlighted, that he says the nervous system cannot distinguish between an event that is vividly imagined and one that actually happened in reality. So what he proposes is sit down and engage in creative visualization in very, very vivid detail, right? Looking at all the specific small details of your environment, almost like you can call it daydreaming, whatever you want to call it. And through repetition, right? Through repetition, your subconscious mind, your self-image, your paradigm will pick up on that information, right? And that's not that far-fetched to think about, because our self-image is already established based on what? Past experiences, or rather, interpretations of our past experiences, right? So he gives an example in the book, in Psycho-Cybernetics, of, let's say I'm in college and I failed a test, right? I can conclude objectively that I have failed that test. Okay, I didn't study, I didn't prepare, whatever the situation is. Or I can attach that to my self-image, right? I can say, I failed that test because I'm a failure, and my failure mechanism is going to express itself in all of my facets of life.
I'm a test failure.
Yes, I'm a test failure. Exactly. That's part of the self-image. So it manifests, right?
Yeah.
And, if this is kind of still ethereal, some simple analogies that are brought up in the book and by Bob Proctor to kind of bring this home is, let's say, autopilot in a plane, or like cruise control, for example, in your car. Those are cybernetic mechanisms, right? What they do is they pick up deviation from a set goal, right? So let's say I'm flying from New York City to Los Angeles, right? It's a long flight. Let's say even if I take off from New York City, right? If I'm 1 degree to the north from New York City, I'm not going to end up in LA, right? That's going to exponentially add to I'm way off course, right? But with that turbulence, what the cybernetic mechanism is going to do, what the autopilot does, pick up that deviation. It kind of extrapolates it out to, if I continue this behavior, where am I going to end up? And it corrects course, right? In the example of the plane, it's going to change the thrust of the engines, change the little altitude or the flaps, the wing flaps, whatever the situation is, and it's going to eventually correct course, right? And this can also be implemented positively and negatively if we don't change it, right? So let's say I'm a salesperson. This is from Bob Proctor. Let's say I'm a salesperson and I have my commission set, my goal set, my self-image programmed for, let's say I'm going to make $100,000 a year, right? And I'm all commission. Let's say I have a really, really big week. I go to a conference and I meet a lot of prospects, whatever happens, and I write $20,000 of business in a week, right? If I continue that, even though it's beneficial, right? More money should be better, right? Even though I would like that, if it's not consistent with my self-image, what's going to happen is my self-image, my cybernetic mechanism, my subconscious mind will pick up the deviation from the set goal, which was 100,000. It's going to feed it into a coordinating mechanism, which is going to correct my course, which means I'm going to underperform until I eventually end up at $100,000 a year, because that's where I'm programmed.
Wow. So it seems like it works both directions.
Sure.
Like there's both the mechanism that when you've got the self-image, your actions will correct toward it.
Right.
But also, if you're acting in a certain way, your self-image will correct toward your actions. So unless you're mindful of it, it seems like the mechanism could go either way.
Yeah.
It actually sort of reminds me of Jordan Peterson's future authoring program, where the whole idea is he has you imagine like the best possible the worst possible future, where if all of your bad habits stayed the way they are, if you stayed acting the way that you are, and nothing got any better, what would happen? Where would you be in 20 years? I don't know. I haven't done the program, but this is my understanding of it. I do own it, but I haven't done it yet. And then the second part, after imagining where everything could be if nothing changes, you imagine the ideal future. If you got rid of all your bad habits, if you fulfilled all your resolutions to, I don't know, go to the gym or eat healthy or whatever, what would your ideal future be? And then you sort of pick somewhere in the middle that to you feels reasonable, feels feasible, and pick some like individual first steps to move in that direction.
It has to be based on reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like it's a similar mechanism where like in this case, it's imagining and extrapolating out into the future, but that idea of the sort of imaginative, it's not really remembering, but it's a similar process to forming memories or recalling memories, can sort of help you course correct toward that at least better future than what could have been.
Right.
Sounds like a similar idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Definitely.
Are there any other like interesting esoteric parts of cybernetics that like are deeper than that, or is it mostly just like those principles and moving outward from that?
I think it's just really fascinating, the sense that your mind and your nervous system, as mentioned before, it's your current self-image is based on analysis of events, right? Interpretation of external events or activities that you partook in or whatever. I think it's interesting that, you can either go out in the world and experience things, and push yourself out of your comfort zone. Let's say be more bold in speaking to people or approaching people, whatever it is you wish to improve. Or you can the book is proposing, you can sort of, sit home and vividly imagine these things, and it's almost congruent, right? That's very foreign to a lot of people. But I mean, at the end of the day, what's really important, I guess, would be the analysis of those events rather than the actual events that happened. And that's profound.
Yeah.
Right. And it's very pragmatic. It happens to all of us in everyday life. That's why, for example, people lose, people go on a fitness journey, they'll lose 10 pounds, they'll put 10 pounds back on, lose 10 pounds, they'll put 10 pounds back on. It's because they have not changed their self-image, right? Their self-image sees themselves as, I can't, they look in the mirror, they say that, oh, that's not really me. That's not actually me. This is crazy. I'm not actually, healthy. I'm not skinny. I see myself as a fat person because I've always been overweight growing up because of my genes, because of, whatever they want to justify it as. And that self-image will express itself, manifest into reality.
Yeah, that's really cool. Well, thanks, Jon. I really appreciate you coming to do this. I think we will have plenty to talk about in the future as well. So if
I'm sure.
at some point you want to come back, open invitation.
I'd love to.
We'll come up with a topic and do that, and maybe get more of your story as well.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. This was Awesome conversation. If you want to learn more about Jon, you can go to xenotheory.org, and that will link to his social media and stuff. You like the way the guy thinks, you want to understand more. I understand he's developing some interesting content for the future, including, he told me he wants to write a book. So
Yeah.
be on the lookout for that. See, now you have to do it.
No time soon. Yeah, you spell get into reality. By the way, that's Xenotheory with an X.
Yes.
Xenotheory.
XENO, xenotheory.org. All right. Thanks, Jon.
Thank you.